now the floor is yours. Yes, please, could you present yourself?
Yes, certainly. Thank you. Simon Stern, University of Toronto. So I really appreciated those follow-up comments on realism, accuracy, and presumptions, because it strikes me, Ayala, that one distinction you might make in the paper is to do with the difference between rebuttable and irrebuttable presumptions. So there was a huge growth industry in 19th century English law in the production of both sorts of presumptions. And for epistemological reasons, it strikes me that it's really worth distinguishing between them. The rebuttable presumptions, presumptions like a husband's been gone for 7 years, he's presumed dead, it's therefore okay for the woman to remarry, is meant in some sense to be realistic. And one of the ways that we know that it's meant to be realistic is that it's capable of being rebutted by actual evidence. The irrebuttable presumptions, like the one that you describe, and like many others, often bear very little relation to reality, very little relation to plausibility. And it strikes me that the whole reason why they are irrebuttable is that, in effect, they're legal stipulations. They're just like the law saying, for purposes of this statute, a houseboat is an inn. For purposes of this statute, a tomato is, a vegetable if you really think that it's a fruit, or a fruit if you really think that it's a vegetable. In other words, we're completely uninterested in describing what common sense or some natural account of the world would tell you is true about these things. There's a policy reason why we're going to do it this way. And so to be legitimate is simply to have been born to a married woman, right? And that's why I think you're right to focus on footnote 6, and why you're right to make the distinction between paternity and legitimacy, because paternity seems to speak to some idea about what we believe about parenthood. Legitimacy is simply a legal stipulation that the law is going to treat the child as born to two married people. So again, for epistemological reasons, it strikes me that there's a significant difference between the irrebuttable and rebuttable presumptions, precisely insofar as they can be sorted out in relation to these ideas about plausibility. And that, I think, also relates nicely to the point you implicitly raised about Wehinger and the philosophy of as if. That is, the as if thinking is surely about the irrebuttable presumptions, like the one that you focus on, and not like the rebuttable ones, because there's no point going around saying we're going to treat X as if it were Y, when we're quite open to having it proved that it's not Y in reality. And I guess I would just finish by saying I think that remains a quite significant distinction in contemporary law. So if you look at burden-shifting provisions under the McDonnell-Douglas rule and anti-discrimination law, if you look at legal presumptions as they operate in the modern law of voting discrimination and the creation of voting districts, there are all sorts of ways in which the law simply says we're going to create this presumption, right? If the employer can't offer a bona fide reason why they're using this test, even though it's been shown to have a disparate impact on a protected class, right? It's open to the plaintiff to come back then and say, well, you've offered this reason, it's not bona fide, right? So there's a presumption in place that we're open to having shifted. And for all of those reasons, I think it would actually make sense to develop that distinction more emphatically.
Yes, this one?
Thank you, Simon. Absolutely, I think you're right. And I think, the rebuttable, irrebuttable question it comes up immediately as soon as you start thinking about it. And it's true that I bracketed, and I think it does belong in here. It was just, it got a little unwieldy, and but I think you're right. I need to find a way. So I absolutely accept that, and I think the examples you gave are make that perfectly clear. I do, however, want to maybe clarify that I think that the And I agree with you that the fictional is the irrebuttable, right? I mean, it's not gonna, it's not gonna help me that I'm gonna say, no, actually, Lord George, he never existed. So, right, that's not, it's the as if. But I do think, and I think you would agree with me also, that the as if and the fictional absolutely depends on the plausible. So it's not matter, right? So in fact, the irrebuttable presumption also depends on the plausible, right? It's exactly the point where the realm of the fictional is the realm of what is plausible, what is usually the case, what is normally the case. We see it actually in the Hebrew presumption, which, if I remember my Jewish law way back, when I went to law school, right, the halacha is rov bilot harabal, right? So most copulations, right? Help me out here. Anyway.
Relationships.
Yes, most relationships are with the husband, and therefore, therefore we're going to just say that it's his, right? So, and so what it does come, and one assumes, that even those who realize, that I absolutely agree with the way you define an irrebuttable presumption, but it's still marked the normal case. And in fact, what we say, the normal case is normal enough, and for policy reasons, as you well said, we're just going to go with a normal case, with a plausible case, and we're not going to, but we all know that the implausible is still possible, right? The implausible is not the same as impossible. So I think that actually plausibility plays a more complex game here, but it can be very useful to explain that distinction between the irrebuttable and the rebuttable.
Thank you. Please present yourself and with the mic.
UC Irvine. As a follow-up to Simon's question, I'm wondering if the status of historicity and the kind of generative quality that the irrebuttable thing would have for historical change would be the same in the rebuttable and the irrebuttable. If you're not making an explicit claim that could be, if you're not having the invitation that something be disproved, is there a way that it doesn't function in the same relation to a kind of extendable historicity as changing? If you're not inviting for it to be disproved, then I'm not clear about whether or not it can still have that kind of norm shifting status in quite the same way that something that invites disproving can.
And then
Can I just answer that?
Yes,
Because I
please.
think I've got it. I think it's just an immediate response. I think that depends on what the it is here. If the it is a specific story, right, we're not inviting, right, then if the it is a specific, we're absolutely not inviting anyone to disprove it. And, the novel makes that very clear, and that reminds me that I have a response to what you said earlier, but we'll go. So if the it is a specific historical, then we're not asking for the rebuttal, and then in that case, you're right. But if the it is the presumption itself, then it invites rebuttal. In other words, there can be policy changes, and there were throughout the 19th century, that call for us to modify the presumption, in part because of its plausibility. So once we, the society, the who we are, the commonality, understands this presumption as no longer working as plausible, either in terms of policy or in terms of what is actually happening, in terms of, then we can change, and therefore the historicity of the presumption remains, even though. So do you see that it depends on what the it is, if it's a specific case, or it is the presumption itself?
I actually think that's true. There's a kind of and I think that the particularity of the argument about the irrebuttable position is the most sort of tantalizing aspect of the paper. But there's a tendency to conflate lots of different kinds of heterogeneity and non-normativity in ways that I think have the effect of obscuring the particular force of this argument about that and its particular relationship to a kind of novelistic fiction.
This is a question about
The mic.
I should have known that. So this is a question about legal history rather than the kind of relationship rather than literature, but maybe it's related in the sense. So the legal sphere that you're examining is the law of evidence, basically. But I was wondering whether kind of one can expand it to look at legal fictions generally in English law, and maybe one can say that kind of there's a history of the use of legal fictions, and maybe there's a decline in the use in the 19th century, and that is in a sense mirrored or reflect. I don't know how to use these terms. But kind of one can think of kind of different genres in literature, like the realist novel, as kind of replicating or being parallel to this movement. So in law, you'd have fictions. Earlier, common law would use fictions, and now we move to the law of evidence, and we use.
We used to have romantic poetry, and now we have realist novel.
Yeah, that's kind of.
Yeah.
So maybe what I'm saying is kind of maybe kind of if the framework can be expanded a little bit to think kind of more broadly about the epistemology of law and the epistemology of literature as being kind of parallel, and then kind of exploring. Maybe it's too wide a frame. I don't know.
Well, the answer is absolutely yes, and also no, a little bit. So. I think that thinking about in the way that I've been thinking here, I mean, that's what it started. I was like, oh, presumption. I mean, my earlier work is about the epistemology of precedent, right, and how that works as an epistemological form, and I also read that with literature. They're not in parallel. This is where I get a little antsy, but before that, so then I said, wait a minute, but presumption is another interesting, and then I was like, oh, I'll write about presumption, and then you're like, whoa, there's a lot here, so I just you just go into the presumption, and even there, so. Could I write a book about presumption, or maybe someone else better? Yes, I think that thinking about presumption, and thinking about the shifts in presumption and the way the shifts in presumption have to do with, in other words, what I'm arguing is that legal epistemology is part and always engaged with, rather than parallel, other epistemological forms. Okay, and I think that. Since presumption is such a powerful, and as we're seeing here that I've just barely scratched the surface, such a powerful epistemological tool, that thinking about those changes or the history of presumption and the history of presumption in tandem, not only with just legal history, but with other modes of knowing and understanding, that I think is what could be really great, especially if someone else did it.
Shall we take all the questions
Sure,
together?
sure.
Okay, Anat? No?
Thank you. Thank you.
We are upgrading this once we have more money.
So I'll
There's a hat outside you can drop it.
I guess something, I mean, this comes from your earlier work as well, right? You're very much concerned with epistemology as a way of knowing an unknown, right? Of knowing something new. But the thing which always emerges from your work actually is the interplay with politics or ideology, right? Because the fact, why do you know something in this way and not another, right? And that seems to connect to be one way to allow you to relate to things which are not completely drawn out in the paper. For example, the move between marriage and the presumption of legitimacy, right? How is that move different in law or in literature or in different historical moments? And I think the relation between epistemology and ideology there would do the work and would be an interesting reflection as well.
Thank you. Nan Goodman, University of Colorado at Boulder. Thanks, Ayelet. It's a really wonderful paper. So it was a real pleasure to read. I guess my question has to do more with the invitation that you make for us to think about legal pluralism in this context as well. And I wondered mostly if you could just clarify what you mean. When I started thinking about legal pluralism in the context of presumption, I started thinking about the many different kinds of presumptions on which the law is based, all of it. So beyond, the actual sort of presumptions by name, things like legitimacy and illegitimacy, or just notions of identity in general. And I started thinking about Gilbert and Sullivan. A little bit of a kind of a strange link, but I wonder if you could talk about, because it seems like legal pluralism is about shifting contexts in many ways, whereas your understanding of presumption here takes a very kind of singular route, and not a pluralistic route, actually. So could you talk a little bit about content versus context, and what you think this adds to the discussion of legal pluralism in a sort of literary world, how we can analogize from legal pluralism into kind of what you seem to be suggesting is a sort of literary pluralism, perhaps, or, yeah. Okay. Okay.
Ravit Reichman, Brown University. There's so many things that I really admired about this paper, loved about this paper, and one of the things that I wanted to talk about or think about together is the way in which narrative voice works, both in the novel that you're talking about, but in novels generally, in the Victorian novel in particular, the realist novel. But it seems to me that the connection or the relationship between conventionality and commonality, right, is often dramatized or staged in the gap between the narrator, right, the realist narrator, and the characters. And one of the times I'm not sure exactly where it is in this in the paper again, but there are a number of actually a number of the passages that you look at here, right, strike me as being ironic in tone, right, and that's something that you don't really get into, right, but that in fact suggests something about the way in which we're supposed to read these characters, so that the kind of anxious reaction to should I go and talk to the neighbors about this, at what level is this kind of private or secret, which is another kind of element or dimension of this, right? The question of secrecy or privacy, and that question of legality as well, in addition to illegitimacy. But the fact is that there's something about that moment, right? That makes the character herself, right, look somewhat petty, right? Or right, so that at the same time as we're also meant to take her very seriously, right, and to take this question of the common good, right, or the communal whole that needs to be protected also seriously, right, so that there's something about that gap that invites a certain judgment that itself is an invitation to some kind of communal awareness, right, at the expense perhaps of the individual, right, so something about that.
Another Reichman, this one, Amnon Reichman from Haifa. Hi, Ayelet. I want to just raise a rather banal question about the relationship between knowing and values. So, of course, there is value in truth and in knowing, and we'll even have a panel on truth. In truth and knowing, and we'll even have a panel on truth later.
And Diora's paper.
Right. And there's also a question of the value of not knowing, right? That is, now the value of not knowing is raised when you have a problem with a deeper value. You don't want to know because you have an issue with the underlying notion of illegitimacy, and it is because of that maybe you don't want to know. And then there is a question of the relationship, and again, it's a historical process, and we can talk about all kinds of interesting historical conceptual questions, the relationship between literature, law, history. What changes the underlying values of that which we don't want to know?
Thank you. Chris, please. Chris, you wanted to ask?
Chris Tillman's somewhere in the University of California. There's an element also, it seems to me, that one doesn't want necessarily to get hung up on a contrast between fiction and reality. There's an element to presumption, which you do actually, you move onto the ground without really occupying it at all. But presumption is one of those beautiful Victorian words in which to presume is to know, but not to be allowed to speak. So in a sense, the truth that Amnon is talking about is something that everyone can know. Thus and such is indeed the case. But to presume to say is a form of presumption, which certain of the characters in your cast, certain of them can speak and certain of them cannot. And that is also a meaning of presumption. And I wonder to what extent you need, just as people are adding to your set of tasks, whether that is also a task that you should take on a little more than perhaps you do.
Yeah. Again, thanks for a wonderful presentation. And by the way, it's somewhat of a continuation of what Chris was talking about, I think. And here I would like to throw in the term of fantasy. So we're talking about the fiction and vis-a-vis the real or the is. And I think that as long as we stick still to the term fiction, there is something normative to it. Right? I mean, as if it's not just something that we desire, but it's something that we want. And it's possible. The legal fiction, right? The legal fiction is something that is normative, it's value-laden, and so forth. And here I actually want to, again, I know that it's outside of the scope of your article, but do you have thoughts about again, the temporality in which the fantasy also begins to emerge, definitely in psychology, where the fantasy becomes extremely important in constructing subjectivity, and here it's not the normatively desire wanted or anything like that, but actually what, again, kind of demarcates the realm of the real.
So now, Ayelet, I presume
Yeah.
that you will be able to relate
I would presume
this
to answer
connection.
all of these in
5 minutes.
5 minutes.
Also relate to Avishalom.
Yes. Okay. Yishai, I'm going to have to bracket yours just because it opens up a whole new thing, and it'll take me 3 hours to talk about it. I think you're talking about, you talk about the fantasy, I'm talking about maybe the ideal, but we're going to bracket it. We're not going to talk about it now, maybe later, sorry. Chris, absolutely. I did mention it. There's I mentioned it in passing, as you say, without occupying it. The thing of what it means to presume, and I think there's a lot of richness there, but again, I had to leave it aside because I was trying to be good about those words. But I think that absolutely the question of presuming, which has to do with social class, right? It has to, who can presume, right? It's a question of social class, and that absolutely comes in. So I think moving from that, I would move to actually to Ravit's question about narrative voice, because the whole presuming, right? I mean, even to use, when the narrator uses, wait, who is it that uses it? Never mind. But the narrator in Trollope is absolutely one of the reasons why he is so good at defamiliarizing the conventional, right? So he uses the art, that whole thing that I was talking about in the beginning about how Trollope is exceptionally good at opening up or laying out the conventionality of much of his realism is precisely through that gap that you said between the narratorial voice and the characters, and that it's a communal, right? So the narrator also occupies a really interesting place, right? The narrator is usually a third person, what some people would call the omniscient narrator, but is not. But occupies an interesting place between an individual and a collective, right? It's an individual voice, but in many ways that narrator has access to a collective mode of thinking. So when the Marchioness, right, the mother of the, she is a totally pathetic and outrageous character. He says, well, he's the Marquis. He should be able to do whatever he wants. What we realize here, I mean, that's how beautiful his tone is. In that one sentence, we, the readers, right, who inhabit this space, know that what she is saying is outrageous. But we also know that it was not outrageous maybe 100 years ago or even 70 years ago, and that her son, the soon-to-be Marquis, the younger son, right, the one who ends up being the Marquis. By the way, the death of the Marquis and his son is actually, we're kind of looking forward to it. It's not a surprising ending. It's kind of built in. So he was never meant to live, and he was never. But that's another thing. But the younger generation, or even the middle generation, already knows that that's a wrong thing to say. That you can't say that. That presumption that a Marquis can do whatever he wants, that is no longer tenable. And what he does is he puts in all that history through the ironic tone in which he describes her saying it, and the fact that she's saying it from under the covers, and her voice is so weak, right? So all of that happens. What it folds within it is an understanding of a shifting terrain, a shifting way of knowing things, and the absolute stress and tension that all these characters are in, because they're trying to place themselves within a shifting epistemological terrain. So I absolutely need to make that more clear, that the irony is there. Not only is it intended, but that it is that which brings out all those things that I can read into the novel. Knowing and value. Amnon. Yes, absolutely, and I think that's what we were getting at earlier with the question of policy, right? And when I said that the presumption itself changes, it's because the values that this presumption is trying to promote, right, are also changing. So how do we engage, right? So all these different presumptions are trying to find a way in which to reconcile values, or to find out what values are. But it's kind of a blind negotiation. It's not that everyone is coming to the table and saying, here are my values and let's decide together. But it is through this epistemological game that we're doing this, which brings me to Nan's question, I think. Nan, you said that I didn't quite address the plurality of presumption, and I think you're right, but what I would like to maybe is kind of turn that inside out and say that what I'm trying to show out is the plurality of engagements within a single presumption, right? So that there's one presumption that I talk about, and you're right, but I talk about the way that different. Originally, when I read this novel for the first time, and I was interested in presumption, what amazed me was that the different sort of evidence questions that the different characters engage with had to do with whatever was at stake in it for them, right? So you challenge you rebut, or you don't rebut, or you perceive. The different characters in this novel all understand presumption differently. Right, so we can say, and we have Cook, and we have all these treatises on presumption throughout the 19th century, and they all say definitively, one way or another, what that presumption is. But that's all good and well, and that's part of it. But other parts of it is that the presumption is understood differently by the way people engage with it, right? So it's that plurality that I'm trying to say, that even though that one presumption exists, everyone knows what it is, it still doesn't function in the same way, and that is what I'm trying to point out here. Epistemology and ideology are not. That's the last thing, I think, right? I'm not missing anyone. Yeah. Oh, well, how will I think that it goes back to sorry, I lost, because I went backwards and I lost my train of thought on this one. Let me try to think. I want to say something else about, and I want to say just to throw that out there, that I think that all of us ended up having to use words like reality and truth. But I think that what I'm trying to say, and we can't but use the words reality and truth, but I want to say that part of what I'm doing, or maybe the major part of what I'm doing, is trying to problematize what reality is and understand that when we say reality, there's also a shifting understanding in what reality is, right? So when we say but in reality, we're not saying but in reality, there's an uncomplicated reality out there, because right, so in fact, that's the thing that I'm trying to explain here, and I think that it is ideological, absolutely, right? So our understanding, and this goes back to what I said maybe about Nan, that our understanding of, I'll be done in a minute, our understanding of the different ways that the characters, again, engage with the presumption is ideologically motivated. It's also just motivated by their financial interests in this thing. So, so ideology is also okay. Thank you.